Hi, I'm Mike Burton, professional comic book artist. We're currently working on London Gothic. This is part two of my video series of how I go about creating the artwork for London Gothic. If you haven't seen part one, there'll be a link in the description to get to part one, which covers the thumbnailing and the penciling. In this episode, we're going to go over the inking process.
So, first things first, we need to get the artwork into the computer so that we can use it for the digital inking process. Now, I don't own a large flatbed scanner. I own a printer with an A4 scanner on top. Now, the artwork's too big to scan in one piece. So I scan it in 4 parts. Now, I could get away with doing it in 2, but there is a reason why we need to do it in 4 parts that I'll explain later. So I align one of the corners with the corner of the scanner, and then I hold the tray down on top and apply a little pressure because there will be light bleed at the sides of on the other side of the paper, and if you hold it down you'll reduce the amount of light bleed. So once I've scanned that first corner, I just shift it along to scan the next, and then turn it around and make sure I scan all 4 corners, making sure to try and keep the alignment with the scanning bed as tight as I can. If it's slightly off on the scan, it'll have to be rotated and adjusted, and it just makes things a lot harder. So try your best to align it both vertically and horizontally with the scanner bed if you can. Okay, so we now got the files in. The way that I scan them is in Photoshop. I use the import WIA support. Start, obviously select your printer / scanner. I do it on color picture. The purpose of that is we've got this non-photo blue that I'm going to want to remove because I actually used the pencils in the final image, which we'll talk about later. Most people, you wouldn't need to worry too much about that, but you probably still want to remove them. But if you're inking digitally, if you've already inked it, you're going to want to color picture scan. But if you're inking it digitally, it won't really matter to you. I also bump up the DPI to 600, which is completely unnecessary because it's already been drawn at a much larger size. But I like to have the highest quality possible because occasionally, sometimes I might want to reuse a background, because in London Gothic we tend not to have blank backgrounds. I'll sometimes reuse it and adapt it and then put it in another location. It might want to be bigger, so I go for very high resolution. So yeah, so we just scan. That's the settings I use for the scan. So then this is what we have. So we've scanned it in our 4 parts, and we need to put these together. So first off, we need to spin these round so they're the right way round. So we're going to go image rotation, 180 degrees. So we'll do that on the 2 upside down ones. Then for some reason I always use this one for it. I don't know why, but I like it because it's top left. So we're going to go image, canvas size, percentage, we're going to put it up to 200%, and just hit the top left corner. And that's going to give us the space we need. It's a little bit more space than we actually need, but oh well. So I'm going to drag these in. And then put these on multiply so I can line them up properly. it is possible, dependent on how well made your scanner is and how much you aligned it, that these might not align 100%. Obviously, if you're using Bristol board, you'll have these to help you line it up. You might need a rotation here and there to adjust it. So that's one in. I'll put that back on normal. Now, one thing to note just before I carry on. So the reason why I'm doing these 4 parts is because the page is too big for the scanner, you get a little bit of light bleed around the edges. So you can see that's slightly more blurry. If I put a adjustment layer in here, I can show you a little bit more clearly. So I darken this up. You can see this on the edge here. We've got this shadowing. So we're going to cut this off quite far down so that none of that appears in the final image. Looks about right. It's a little bit off. The rotation is a little bit off. So you can see here, it's slightly off on this one. So is it that way? I just eyeball this really. Obviously, if it's inked, you might want a better solution for this. But aside from buying a much more expensive scanner, this gets the job done. Let's take that back on normal. Okay. So now, again, if you're using Bristol board, it makes this much easier. So I just tend to go for this. This is a center line right here. So I go a little bit over the center line onto that panel border guide, and then same for the height. And then I just pop in a layer mask there. And do that for all 4. So we're just chopping out any chance of that light bleed being on these. Then if we put the layers back on, then we can see we've got the full scan page larger than A3, all aligned correctly without having an A3 printer. So we're just going to go image trim, transparent pixels, and now we've got it a regular size. So I tend to drop in a white layer on the back, just in case there's any gaps. Well, you see a bit of a gap there. Then I scan it quite light, so I'll generally drop in a levels layer just to darken that up slightly, make those lines a little bit more clear for the inking. Maybe a little bit more. And then I save this out as a PNG. And that completes the pencils. Okay, so before we get started on the inking, I just want to talk about the equipment that I use. So this is just a bog standard graphics tablet, USB graphics tablet. I picked it up for 20 quid pre-owned. You don't need an expensive graphics tablet. The sort of bog standard ones will be good enough. I used to have one of the more expensive ones which has a screen on it, so you're drawing directly onto a screen. And to be fair, it takes some time to get used to that you're drawing here and it's appearing up on the screen. But to be honest, the feel with the ones with the screen where you're actually drawing onto them, that because of the thickness of the screen, it doesn't feel right anyway. So you're the way you actually place the pen on, you can't really get the alignment right anyway. So there's this slight sort of difference in the feel between actual drawing and this anyway, so you're going to feel that anyway. And it takes a little bit of time to get used to, obviously, drawing down here. But for the amount of money extra that they are, for the ones on the screen, for me, I don't think it's worthwhile. I don't think it's worthwhile. You get used to this after a little while. And it's more than good enough. So don't spend a load of money on one if you don't have it. Don't feel like you need it to be able to do digital art. One like this will do you just fine. Okay, so this is the template that I use for all of the pages in London Gothic. Now, like I said before, your template will probably be different because you'll probably not be working at A4. I've set guides up for the bleed, etc. So this layer here, that's where the actual comic book will be. So that's the cutoff of the actual comic, the trim of the comic. So we've got this extra area up here. This is for the bleed, so that when it goes to print, there's a little bit extra either side. So if you're doing a big print run and it's slightly misaligned, you're not going to end up with a big white line down the side of the page. So that's for this one's for reference, for in case we ever use American comic book size. That's not really that important. So so this is how I set it all up. Yours will be different. If I can find some, I'll leave some links to some free templates that you can use. The file size for this, so I actually this is actually 300 dpi at the correct size. I'd like to do it bigger, but the thing is, with London Gothic, there's a hell of a lot of layers that go into it, and the file sizes get very large, like quite a few gigabytes, because I like to keep them as editable as possible. So I sacrifice a little bit in that, but this is how we'll be printing it. And if it needs boosting up slightly in size, most of the elements are already at high quality, so we could bump it up a little bit larger if needs be. So yeah, and when you're working on such a big book and you get like 82 pages in, you've got a couple of gig per file, it certainly gets data management becomes quite difficult. So okay, what we're going to do then is we're going to drop in our pencils that we created. Now, what I tend to do for this is I convert this to a smart object, so I can go inside and make changes. I can also increase the size of it and what have you, and retain its quality. So I'll line this up with my guides. Obviously these won't be quite right because it's American page size, so I do tend to adjust here. So like, for example, it was drawn at this sort of size. This is how it should align, but I might want a little bit more of this bottom panel in, so I might make it a little bit smaller just to keep a bit more of that in. The next thing I do is I'm going to drop in the borders. Now what I tend to keep is, in the template, I keep quite a few different borders that are already aligned with correct spacing at the sides. So I can just adapt these for use in each page. So let's take that one. So this center one, I haven't actually decided where I'm going to split these up yet. I think I might come at them with at a bit of an angle. So I'm going to duplicate this. I'm quite off about there. Let's see. Now this is a landscape shot, and I want to extend this all the way out to give sort of a panoramic look. And once again on this last panel, I want this to bleed over. So I'm going to have those other panels just sit slightly over the top of it. And then I'm going to select those. Select inverse and select expand. Just by one. And then I'm going to use them as a layer mask on that one. Now for these ones, when I have panels that sit on top of another one, I like to increase the stroke size because they look a bit flimsy if they're really thin. These one will be reflected in the final image. So just sit over there a little bit, and we'll be removing some more of them here where I want the sort of characters to pop out a little bit from the panels. Okay, so that's the border. So now I separate the inks out onto multiple layers, and there's a reason for that. So because I'm inking digitally, obviously I've got the opportunity to be able to have, for example, the character outlines to be on a separate layer to the details, and that's just to make colouring easier later, doing the colour flats. So if I'm having someone else colour flat it, I'll actually turn off the detail layers and send it over to them. But we'll go a bit more into detail about why that is when I go into the colouring. Now for the inking, I have a brush preset, which is an inking brush. Now the brush itself is actually a brush that I created, a brush preset that I created following a tutorial many years ago now. So I can't specifically remember all the details about how I made it, but I will leave a link in the description to a tutorial that will take you through the process of how to create your own inking brush. Important to note is to make sure, usually when you select the brush, the spacing will be at 5%. You want 0 spacing for your inking brush. You also want the touch sensitivity on for size. So if the spacing's high, one second, right, so another thing, make sure that's on multiply, the pencils. I put the pencils on the top and I have it on multiply. So if the spacing's high, let's see if you can see this, you'll get this effect. This is where the brush is spacing out, and if I increase it more, you'll see more significantly. Now, unless you're actually going for that style, you know, that's not what we want. So we'll keep that down to 0. For the smoothing, I have it on 95%. Now this is the main reason why I ink in Photoshop and ink digitally, because to do traditional inking you have to have an incredibly steady hand in order to do the difference in pressure. Now I'm sure a lot of you have tried traditional inking and you've ended up with something that kind of looks like this. That's exaggerated, but basically where your pressure on the paintbrush is you're moving too slow. Basically, you have to be really quick and efficient with your swipes, and it's a ball ache if you make a mistake. Now, with the smoothing option in Photoshop, it sort of smooths out all of those sort of slight little tremors in your hand, and it's very, I mean, it's cheating, but you see you can sort of get quite a nice tail off without much skill required. Plus you can have different sizes. It's like having all different sizes of brushes, and you've got an undo button. So it's inking on cheat mode basically. Now what I tend to do is, first off, I'll go in for the heavy inks. I like to do the heavy inks in the outlines first, and I tend to use like a 35 maximum, usually 30 size brush. That might be different depending on the size of your page, but you just get a feel for what you think is nice. And then I just do my outlines on one layer. Oh, also when I'm working on a particular panel, sometimes I'll just select it, control and click on the actual border of that particular panel, and that'll make it so that my ink lines won't extend beyond them. Now, an important thing to think about when you're inking is light direction and what's in the foreground and what's in the background. So here, this is his arm, and I want this to be sort of prominent. I want that to be in the front. So I want this to have a thicker line as it sits on top of whatever is behind it. And that tricks the eye into thinking that it's the closest thing to the view. But you also want to think about where the light is coming from, and then have thicker lines away from the light as well to show that shadow. So it's a balancing act really as to where you want to put those. If you go completely realistic with it, it's not going to look the best. So the other thing I do is, one of the benefits of inking digitally, if you've got things such as like an explosion, something where you want a really straight line, you can use paths and strokes. So I don't tend to use the simulate pressure for it, but if you want a nice clean line, strokes are the way to go. So you just draw a path with the path tool and go over to paths, right click the work path, click stroke path, make sure it's set to brush, and then just stroke it. So here I really want to sell the fact that this is a cliff and that we're looking down. So I'm going to use quite thick lines to show the edge of the cliff. And then I'm going to use a lot lighter lines for everything down below to give that illusion of distance. Another thing to take into consideration is where you want the viewer's eyes to go. So for example here, this ground, although it's going to be quite detailed, I don't want it to pull too much focus. So I'm using just a thin line weight and not varying the thickness of the line too much, because I just don't want to pull the eye away from what is the most important thing, which is this character here. That's why he's in the foreground and it's more heavily shadowed, and then what he sees. Although these guys are far back, so they're going to have a low line weight as well, I've silhouetted them against the sky to give them a little bit more prominence. And I don't want this to pull too much focus, so I'm still using a thin line weight, even though in reality it's now starting to get closer to him. It's more in the foreground, so you'd want heavier line weights. But it's something to take into consideration whilst you're working on it, is that it's not always about what's most realistic, but what gets the point across the best. So one quick time saving tool, if you don't know about it, if you hold shift and draw a line with your brush tool, it'll keep it perfectly straight, even if you veer off. Okay, so if you look at this top panel, you can sort of see what I was talking about with using the thicker lines to sort of represent things that are closer to the viewer. If I turn the pencils off, you can kind of see this illusion where over here, these overhangs where they're sitting in front of these other elements, that they sort of give this illusion that it's going sort of further back into the background, and then having the variations in the line weight more so in the thicker lines. It's all about the amount of detail that we're seeing. So, like, it might seem like the best thing to do is to put as much detail in as possible, but that's one of your tools at your disposal, is how little detail you also put in. So as you get further back into the distance, you see less and less detail, so there should be also less and less variation in the line weight, and it just pushes it further back, because if you think about it, the line weight, what you're actually representing is the variation in shadow on the edge, and as it gets further back, that variation is going to be the same, but it's so far away that you can't see it. So it helps to give this bit of an illusion of it sort of moving a bit further into the background. It doesn't have to be dramatic, but it makes a big difference. If all these lines were the same, it'd look like a very flat image. But that's something to take into consideration. To be honest, I fall foul of it sometimes of putting too much detail in the background. But you always want to be, as you're inking, make sure you take a step back and look at the full page quite often. And turn your pencils off and see how it's going. Like you can see here, this edge line, it's looking pretty much like this is in the foreground and all this is in the background. But I probably want to, although normally I wouldn't do it for the smoke, I might actually just put a bit of a thicker line over that as well around here, just to really distinguish that this is the foreground and that's the background. So it's just another one of those things to take into account when you're creating your piece, and it'll take it from looking flat to looking more three-dimensional. We'll talk about some of the other tricks to use to sell that when we get into the colouring phase. Okay, so we're pretty much done with the outlines. I'm going to block out where the borders are. I mean, some of these aren't going to be the final borders anyway, but I'm going to block it out so I can see how the final image is going to look. So I'm just creating layer masks on them, and then I'm just going to paint out the borders where I want the character to overlap. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do, so if we turn off the pencils, I will end up coming back to probably fill out some more of those lines as I go through. But what I'm going to do now is create a new layer for the details. This is so that when we get to the colouring phase, I can turn the details off, and it means I can select areas a lot easier. It'll just speed that process up. So for the details, I tend to use either a 15-point brush or a 10-point brush, so I tend to keep them very sort of very thin, so that the actual lines themselves are more distinct from the details. Just as a side note, so when I was talking before about where you don't put detail is important as well. Hair is a great example, because obviously, so you draw hair in clumps, which is already a method of that. You don't draw every individual strand. But also, if you look at like this area here, this is a clump, and I draw some of the strands at one end of the clump and some of the other end, and by doing that and leaving this part out with no detail, it looks like the detail's blown out, so it's too bright for us to see it. So that looks like a highlight on the hair, and then where the detail is, it makes it look darker. So by leaving that bit out, if I was to fill that in, it wouldn't look, it would lose something, because you've not got that depth, and it's all about trying to create that shape in 3 dimensions. So you look at it and you go, well, would there be a highlight on his hair there? Maybe not. Maybe it would just be dark. But I want to sell this shape of the head there, so I'm going to put one in. And the thing is that no one's going to know that light wouldn't hit there if it wouldn't hit there. So it's about knowing when you can get away with those things and what techniques you can use. And you want to be using literally everything to try and sell that 3D effect, even if it's not actually appropriate or not actually realistic in that sense. It's obviously, there's only so far you can push that, but it's just another tool in your arsenal, and you need to be using everything that you've got, because it's a flat image and you're trying to sell it as a 3D image, so you've got to use every little thing that you can to try and sell that. Okay, so I've done pretty much all of the inks now. I'm not going to do the clouds and the sky on that first panel, because I'm going to be doing them during the colouring phase. Looking over it now, I feel like I need to add in some weight lines here and there. So I'm going to go in and maybe darken up some of these areas to make the characters pop a little bit more. Add a few details into them. Okay, so I'm going to select the borders now. I'm going to contract it by 2 just to make sure it's in the borders. And I'm going to use this as a mask for the inks. And then I'm going to re-add in for any of the areas where the inks go over the line. So just tidy up any loose inks. and this is the final inked page. The next part is going to cover the colour flatting process and the colouring process itself. So make sure to subscribe here so you don't miss the next part. There's also some other things on our channel. We've got a podcast, Two Evil Scoundrels, where we talk about all elements of creating your own comic book, going to Comic Cons, things like that, even character design. So you can check them out on our channel now. If you want to pick up London Gothic, which is the page that I've been working on for London Gothic Chapter 3, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are available on our website right now. And we do full international delivery, so you can get it no matter where you are. So I'll see you next time.